But it is so very good to be here with you for a second day and to see the work that's being done here in Australia. I mean, this is wonderful, this hallway out here, just to see these different organizations, to see John Henry Newman College, dear to my heart, and to see how the church's model of education is being expanded and taking root here in Australia. And I mean that when I say that this is the church's model of education. I mean, yesterday I met people from the Catholic tradition and Protestant tradition and the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And this really is the church's model of education. Now, why make that claim? And it's a claim that might surprise some people when I say that the classical model of education is the church's model of education. Let's start with the phrase, the Great Commission. The Great Commission of the church. This is a phrase that some of you may be familiar with. It was first used by the Dutch missionary Justinian von Veltz, popularized by the English missionary Hudson Taylor, and others after him. And they use this idea of the Great Commission to describe Christ's command to the church to take the gospel of the church to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, as quoted in Acts 1. And the fulfillment of this Great Commission really undergirds the Creed's claim that the church is both one, there aren't multiple churches, and Catholic. It's universal, it's extended to the four corners of the earth. But stay with this word commission with me for a second. The word commission can sound like a command, or like Christ gave the church marching orders to take into the world. But the Latin committere and the English commission, they carry this lovely connotation of entrusting, maybe more than commanding. So in the City of God, we read this from Augustine: Deus commissit regnum hominibus. God entrusted the kingdom to humans. And in Hugh of St. Victor's De Sacramentis, Deus commissit homini potestatem super universum. God has entrusted to man authority over the creation, over the universe. And in his Didascalicon, Doctrina vero quae committitur discipulis non debet esse absurda. That teaching which is entrusted to students should not be absurd. It's like a fair warning to teachers, right? Yeah, like it shouldn't really be absurd. But the idea there is entrusting, and all three of these ideas. It's like something is being given over and entrusted to the people to whom it's given. And that is at the heart of this word commission. So let me raise the question again and restate my claim. The question is this: does the church's Great Commission from Acts 1, from Christ, include taking education, and more specifically classic liberal arts education, to the world as part of its calling? Does the Great Commission include taking this model of education to the world? And my claim is yes. My home institution, Eastern University in Philadelphia, often uses the phrase, taking the whole gospel for whole persons to the whole world, which kind of echoes that claim, often misattributed to Irenaeus, but true nonetheless, that the glory of God is a man fully alive. But what does the whole gospel include? Right? How does the church nurture fully alive persons? Well, back to John Henry Newman, whom I'm very fond of quoting. Newman rightly points out that everywhere the church has gone, it has built 3 buildings, not just one. What are the 3 buildings the church has built everywhere it's gone in the world? What are they? Churches, schools, hospitals. Good. So let's say the church has built naves, right? Naves for worship and the care for souls. Hospitals for healing and the care of bodies. And of course, schools for education and the care of hearts and minds. Whole gospel for whole persons. Man fully alive. So we could say that these 3 buildings function like kind of focal staging grounds for the church's single work of nurturing the formation made possible by nature and the reformation made necessary by sin. That at least seems to be the idea of this other educator I often revere to, Hugh of St. Victor in the 12th century Paris. So let's take the latter idea first, the most obvious one for the work of the church, that the church's commission includes attending to the reformation work made necessary by sin. See, for Hugh, the idea is that though people were created in a good world to know it, live in it, act in it, and make stuff with it, that world and its creatures, both human and non-human, have been corrupted. Right? The soul is corrupted by sin and evil, the body by disease and decay, the heart and mind by vice, ignorance, and error. Hence the need for the reforming work of the church in the nave for the sake of the soul, the hospital for the body, and the school for hearts and minds. I mean, this presents the church's work as a kind of multi-front resistance movement against the manifold anti-creation forces that are alive and awake in the world. We could say that these three activities maybe are more like three workstations within a single repair shop. Right? Or we could compare this work to maybe that of a gardener pulling the dandelions and the morning glories so the cucumbers and the calla lilies can grow as they are naturally designed to grow. But again, this reformation work seems like a single work of God's people on three fronts: in the nave, the hospital, and the school, which Hugh of St. Victor describes as activities of God's saving grace in the world. But here, step to the second point. The church, hospital, and school, the nave, hospital, and school, they do more than simply get us saved, right? And cure our illnesses and correct our errors, as if they're only lifting us out of the pit and putting us on level ground somehow. See, the church also helps us grow in faith and devotion. The hospital and medical professions help us maintain and improve our health, or at least slow the decline for some of us. The school helps us expand our knowledge, order our loves, and integrate our understanding, like we talked about yesterday in my final session on the sevenfold areas of formation leading to human flourishing. Hugh describes this work of the church as an extension of God's creating grace in the world. God's saving grace in the reformation work of the church, God's saving grace in the formational part work of the church. You with me? All right. So the church both repairs the ruins and beautifies the structure. It pulls the weeds and grows the flowers, resists the enemy without, and encourages culture within, so that so we actualize the imago Dei in which we were created, keeping life from being nasty, poor, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes said it could be. So Hugh develops this even further. So go with me more. Education in particular channels God's creating grace to develop our God-given natural desires and ability to know creation and name it. An early wonderful, playful part of the Didascalicon and his De Sacramentis, Hugh speculates that God left Adam to name the animals precisely so that Adam could develop his intellectual and creative powers, could get to know the creation that he was charged to care for, and discover for himself more reasons to praise God. I mean, Hugh says God could have named the animals, an angel could have named the animals, but he said, no, he wanted Adam to do it so he could exercise his creative intellectual abilities, get to know the creation, and find more reasons to praise God. He's got this wonderful line that to me is a great affirmation of the exploration of the world through science and math, where Hugh says, God would not be praised in all his works by the rational creature if all the works of God were not known by the rational creature. Isn't that wonderful? Like the more that we know, the more we discover, the more we have got to praise God with. And that is a great affirmation and approval of our increasing understanding and engagement with the created world. You see, he thought education was central to salvation history. Hugh, among all of our Christian educators, was one of the best at locating education within God's great plan of salvation history because it channeled God's creating grace, teaching us about creation and the arts and our place in the world, and God's recreating or reforming grace. Somewhat provocatively, Hughes says that we are restored through instruction. we come to understand who we are and who God is and what the world is and our place in it through instructions. And perhaps this is why the church built 3 structures, not just one, everywhere it went. That alongside naves and hospitals, it built schools. He also suggests that even if the human creature never made it into the nave, what they received from the school and what they received from the hospital was good for them given the human nature that they had. So this single work of the church in its 3 buildings was a bit of a discovery for me. And it took me some time to discover this threefold work of the church. And I was really surprised, and maybe some of you have had the same experience, maybe not. I was surprised to discover at one point in time that all of the theologians and churchmen and churchwomen, leaders that I had been reading for a long time as a systematic and historical theologian, which is what I was trained to be, so many of them were also, or sometimes primarily also, school teachers and homeschool moms and principals and academic deans and normal classroom teachers and administrators who fought curricular battles and really spent most of their working life in a place like this, in the classroom, moving between the contemplative life of contemplation and reading and the active life of teaching and walking alongside students. So a few of these. There's Clement of Alexandria. Maybe you know these names. Origen, Cyprian, and Augustine. These early church fathers and classical Christian educators on the African continent. Gregory of Nazianzus and Basil of Caesarea in Asia Minor. These 2 places, by the way, North Africa and Asia Minor, are the headwaters of the classical Christian tradition. This is where, it's a longer conversation, but this is where the church really hammered out what we're doing today. Where they, as early church fathers, received the tradition from the Greeks and the Romans and said, what do we do with this? And what can we save and what can we sift and sort that is compatible with the gospel so that we can pass it on to others? But it was in North Africa and Asia Minor that this initially happened. Of course, then there's all kinds of other educators. There's 6th century Boethius in Rome, 9th century homeschooling mom Duoda, who wrote this wonderful handbook of spiritual formation for her teenage son. There's the 10th century playwriting nun Hratsvita of Gandersheim, one of my favorite, who was the first Christian to write plays on the European continent, and she modeled them on the Roman playwright Terence, and she wrote them for the other sisters in her convent. There is, of course, the 12th century Hugh of St. Victor we've been talking about, Thomas Aquinas, Christine de Pizan, and the 15th century, all in Paris. There's the 8th century Alcuin, 14th century John Wycliffe, 15th century John Colet, 19th century John Henry Newman, all in England. There's also one of my favorites. He's already up here, this handsome-looking man here, Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon was a 16th century reformer alongside Martin Luther, but he was also the first professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg. And he loved Aristotle and loved Homer and spent as much time writing commentaries on them as he did the scriptures. There's also the 18th century Methodist evangelist John Wesley, you might know of. Wesley's interesting because he wrote an entire curriculum in the classical Christian tradition for his 18th century school, the Kingswood School in Bristol, which served the poorest of the poor in Bristol. So Wesley leaves us this full curriculum for this school that served inner city kids in Bristol. And listen to what's part in their curriculum. So they taught Bible, of course, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, history, geography, rhetoric, logic, ethics, natural philosophy, and the mathematics. Their library at this very, very poor school in Bristol had Boethius, Cicero, Grotius, Pythagoras, Isocrates, Milton, Locke, Thomas More, Isaac Newton, Pascal, Ovid, Pliny, Tacitus, contemporary natural science books, and something called political arithmetic. I really don't know what that is, but I want to get my hands on that book. There's also the 19th century Samuel Crowther in Nigeria, the Baptist missionary William Carey, who also started classical Christian schools in India in the 19th century that look very similar to what we're doing today. There's C.S. Lewis in Oxford, and then, of course, my own mentor and teacher and boss, J.I. Packer, who studied greats at Oxford just like John Henry Newman did. who loved, when I was with them for several years, we talked as much about literature as we did the Puritans and as much about classical philosophy as we did the prayer book, which is one of his great, great loves. What I want you to see, though, at all these faces that are up here, is that these teachers, these church men and women, they nurtured the intellectual, moral, aesthetic, and spiritual formation of young people around the world in the true, good, beautiful, and holy because it was integral to their work in the church. It wasn't secondary to their work as churchmen and women. It wasn't ancillary to their work as churchmen and women. They saw it as central to their work as churchmen and women. As ordained, some of them were, and as lay people, as most of them were. See, this is just what the church did as it expanded around the world. It built naves and hospitals and schools. Now, of course, to this list, could be added thousands, tens of thousands of names of people we've never heard of because they're more like us. Classroom teachers, faithfully attending to the students in front of them, developing the tradition, passing it on, and then fading away into obscurity like, frankly, most of us will, right? But who were faithfully serving the calling in front of them to attend to these students in this place at this time, being faithful to their calling to extend the work of the church through the school. Now, one of the places, and here I want to intersect with my own story as Sarah asked me to do, one of the places that the people of God's church built a school in order to take up their part in this Great Commission 45 years ago was in a very humble city in the center of North America called Topeka, Kansas. Topeka, Kansas is a little bit like Nazareth. Can anything good come out of Topeka? It's the capital of Kansas, but that's really all it's got going for it. It's not an interesting place. Nobody holidays in Topeka. It's in what some people on the East Coast call, it's in one of the flyover states. I'll just say, when I lived in Vancouver, British Columbia for a decade, I had lots of friends come visit me. When I lived in Oxford in the UK, lots of friends come visit me. When I lived for 7 years in Topeka, Kansas, no friends came and visited me. And there's a reason. But in 1980, there was a little school founded in Topeka, Kansas. And the founders were former students of an integrated humanities program at the nearby University of Kansas in Lawrence. And this integrated humanities program was ran by two Catholics and an Anglican, and often it's just called the IHP program. But these graduates who founded the school that I taught at for 7 years, they wanted to extend to their children what they had had in university, which was an education in the classical liberal arts tradition taught in the poetic mode that attended to their integrated intellectual, moral, aesthetic, and spiritual formation. And so they founded this little school in Kansas in 1980 for their own kids. They also founded it because the leaders of the IHP program who are up here said that, it's great that you guys are getting this formation at college when you're 18 and 19. But man, it would have been better if you had got it when you were 8 and 9. It would have been better if you'd got it when you were 3 or 4. It would have been better if you were nurtured in this all the way up so you didn't have to play catch up like so many of us are doing, right? Who didn't receive this education growing up. We've spent most of our adult lives, as I have, catching up on what I could have got maybe when I was 10 or 11 or 12 and what so many of our students can get if they're in one of our schools. So these 7 families in Topeka, Kansas founded the first classical Christian school of the contemporary era called Care Paravel Latin School. And yes, our mascot was a rampant lion, Aslan, and yes, we had 4 vans named Edmund, Peter, Susan, and Lucy. And yes, we had an annual Aslan lecture series, and yeah, it got a little goofy sometimes. But the vision of the founders, they were informed by Lewis, but they loved that line in Lewis in the Narnia Chronicles, if you know them, and I hope you do, that gets repeated over and over again. Once a king and queen of Narnia, what? Always a king and queen of Narnia. The idea being that the formation that our students received in our school, they wouldn't leave that behind when they graduated, right? Once formed as a king and queen of Narnia, always a king and queen of Narnia. And it started with this vision that we are shaping their hearts and their minds. We are forming people 8 and 18-year-olds who can be good 28, 48, and 68-year-olds. Once a king and queen, always a king and queen. Now, the story is for another time, and it's a really great story of how the IHP program came to be. But the three of the professors who ran it, John Sr., Frank Nellick, and Dennis Quinn, they were friends with a guy named Mortimer Adler. And Adler was a guy behind the great books movement in the 20th century. He had been at Columbia University. By this time, he had come to the University of Chicago, which was a few hours north of Topeka. So he used to come down to the program and teach in it and lecture on it and hang out with Nellick, Quinn, and Senior here. And at the tail end of the program came this guy. Oh, sorry, Jim, your picture's pixelated. But this guy, James Taylor, who became a friend of mine and wrote a book called Poetic Knowledge, which reflects on the IHP program and this mode of teaching that they tried to practice. Now, in the surprising work of God, 18 months after Care Paravel was started in Topeka, Kansas, 2 other classical Christian schools were started entirely independently of each other and of Care Paravel. One was in Moscow, Idaho, another Nazareth, and the other one in South Bend, Indiana. Another Nazareth, except for the fact that it's got Notre Dame University in it, but otherwise a very uninteresting small Midwestern town. When I first learned this story, the only analogy I could come up with was like the Great Awakening in England, when you had these revivals starting all over England within weeks of each other that were entirely independent. It's this really funny story that these 3 schools in 3 entirely different places started, and only after 2 or 3 years later did they start to discover one another. But they were all rediscovering and trying to reclaim this tradition of the church's education that had been lost. Now, for me, I don't want to talk too much about myself, but I had been going to Topeka my whole life because I had family there, but I had no idea about this school that was trying to, hammer out classical Christian education in the 1980s and 90s while I was visiting family there. Like many of you, I had a mom who was a reader, and she read us good books. And I discovered Greek and Roman mythology as a kid and was always drawn to the great books and classics in literature, philosophy, and theology as a teenager because I found them both enriching and refreshing compared to a lot of the stuff that we were being given in school. So I didn't encounter Care Paravel Latin School until I went away to Vancouver, Canada, which is, actually up there. But I had done my bachelor's degree was in biblical literature. In a way, it was a degree in the greatest of the great books, composed of at least 66 books, but it was a great education in learning to read ancient texts in the original languages. After that, I did systematic and historical theology with Dr. Packer, as I mentioned, up in Vancouver, and with a professor who had been a student of a guy named Alan Bloom, who wrote a very famous book in 1987 called The Closing of the American Mind, and was also involved with St. John's School and the great books kind of movement. So I was getting this from multiple sources, but I didn't know there was an actual model of education offering this to, as we call it, K-12 schools. Several things ushered me into this work, just as a quick aside, because like many of you, I went searching for what I didn't know existed. And I think I was looking for something that I didn't think was there. I thought about pastoral ministry. I was thinking ordination for a long time, but I always found myself most alive right here in the classroom. And I was a teaching assistant and worked with students all the time. And I was like, that's where I think I really want to be. But then, so that was one piece, but I didn't know what that was going to look like yet. Then another piece that happened for me in the late 90s, I started doing pretty serious study of technology and the ways that technology was coming to increasingly inframe our lives. And so this is a decade before the iPhone was out, but I was reading names, some of these you might know, Heidegger and Jacques Ellul and Neil Postman and George Grant and Albert Borgman. And I became increasingly concerned in the late 90s about technology coming to inframe the lives of teenagers. Earlier in the 90s, right after college, I had owned my own cafe, art gallery, and internet cafe. For those of you old enough to remember internet cafes, where you would go in and you'd pay some money to dial up into the internet, and we can all, that sound, whatever it is. So you could surf whatever was on the internet in 1994 when we opened, which was not much. and half of which was not good, right? So it wasn't that I didn't know technology, but even then, when I saw teenagers starting to get their flip phones, and I saw them in groups, even then in the mid-90s, they would come into my coffee bar and sit by themselves isolated on their flip phones, texting friends who weren't there. And so as I read more and more about technology, I became increasingly concerned, and I felt deeply that I wanted to be part of a resistance movement. I wanted to be part of something that countered that increasing inframing of teenagers' lives by technology. And so I thought, okay, maybe that is through higher education. And then I happened to have a friend who said, hey, have you ever heard about these schools? I think they're called classical Christian schools. You should check them out. And I never heard of them. And so I went Googling, and like many of you again, I found what I didn't know existed. And so I started then my apprenticeship here at Cair Paravel Latin School, where I spent 7 years teaching English and philosophy and creative writing, as I mentioned yesterday, and aesthetics and political philosophy, and coaching the girls' soccer team, and leading school trips, and being the academic dean, and all the kinds of things that people do in these small private schools. So I was there for 7 years, and even though it was the first one, we were still definitely in the discovery mode and the recovery mode, trying to figure out what it was that we were recovering while we did it. I mean, very much like sailing the ship when you're on the water, flying the plane, building the plane while you fly it. And we had all the same kind of struggles that anybody does who has a school. I loved our founders, but sometimes our founders and our board were a little too involved. And we had parents who wanted the Christian and put up with the classical, and parents who wanted the classical and put up with the Christian. Both of them wrongly separating those two things, which my argument is those are the same things, that this is the education of the church. And we were trying to figure out our curriculum and trying to, integrate it in the best way that we could. But after 7 years, I at least felt like I needed to do more work in this tradition, that I wanted to have a stronger role in this recovery. So I went then to I left Cair Paravel and I went to the University of Oxford so that I could do a degree in Christian ethics, largely focused on this tradition that we're a part of, focusing on these three guys, Hugh of St. Victor, Philip Melanchthon, and John Henry Newman, which is why you hear me quote them so many times. But they are our three pinnacles in this tradition leading up to what we're doing now. So when I came back from Oxford then, again, I wanted to be involved, and so I came to the Templeton Honors College, where we were able to start a master's program to train teachers in classical education, because so many of us had not grown up in it, and we needed training in the tradition. I will say for Cair Paravel, it was a game changer when we were able to start hiring our own graduates back to teach, because then those students had gone through this formation from the beginning, like the IHP guy said it would be the best. And now I'll say 3 of my former students are teaching my classes at Cair Paravel. Pretty wonderful to look back and see these goofy Nathaniel Boggs. As a high school senior, one of those guys you just kind of shake your heads at. And what's going to become of Boggs? Well, now Boggs teaches my class and teaches my poetry and teaches my texts. And it really then meant that this culture could just deepen rather than always kind of reinventing it with new people that came. So out of this small place in Topeka, this Nazareth-like place, began this renewal of the church's model of education. That, as I want you to have seen, has always been the church's model of education everywhere it's gone in the world. And where has it gone? Well, let me introduce us and just give you a bit of a snapshot about where classical education is now developing in the world and how it's developed over the last few years. Let's start with Africa, all right? So in 2019, I was invited, along with some other people in a group we call the Alcuin Fellows. We were invited to speak at a conference in Nairobi, Kenya on classical education. And none of us really knew much about the African scene, but there was an organization called the Rafiki Foundation, which is working, for 40 years had orphanages in 10 countries across Central Africa. Well, in the early 2000s, they transitioned all of their orphanages and these beautiful campuses in 10 African countries to boarding and day schools that were modeled on the classical Christian model of education. So in 10 African countries, you had these vibrant classical Christian schools with several hundred students in each one of them, and they wanted to put on a conference where they could bring their teachers together to Nairobi, and they flew a few of us down. Well, hold on to that. When I was in 2023, I was at a dinner at the House of Lords in England with some MPs and a baroness who was hosting us, and they wanted to talk about classical education. And I was just coming from Uganda and Nigeria on another trip, and I said to the MPs and baroness, I said, it's really great that you guys are interested in classical Christian education, but you're 20 years behind Kenya. That got their attention. You're 20 years behind Kenya. Why? Because at that first conference in 2019, we had 400 people come from 10 African countries to Nairobi, including the First Lady of Kenya, including church members and politicians who represented 45,000 schools that were interested in classical education. Not just 45,000 students, but 45,000 schools interested in this model and how they could begin to adopt this model across their school systems. 2 years ago, the Kenyan government, and this is why I said this to Baroness Stroud, 2 years ago, the Kenyan government officially approved Rafiki's classical Christian education for use in any school across Kenya that wanted to use it as part of their national curriculum. So any school can adopt their classical Christian model and then can go through Rafiki's teacher training program. Now there's a major university in Kenya called St. Paul's University, which is developing programs to train teachers in Kenya. Remarkable work. 2 years ago, we had similar conferences in Uganda and Kenya again. And then last fall, I was in Jos, Nigeria, not in the capital, really felt like out in the sticks, but we had, again, over 500 people come to this conference in Jos, Nigeria, interested in classical education. And so the work across Central Africa is astonishing. And I keep telling them, hey, this began on your continent. It just happens to be coming back right now, but this began the headwaters in North Africa, as I mentioned earlier. All right, so that's Africa. China. One of my colleagues that just joined us in our program at Templeton, Ravi Jain, last year, again from Oxford. Ravi has spent tons of time working in China. And Ravi tells me that there are probably 100 million Christians in China, but recently the Chinese government made it illegal to take your children to church, even at state-sponsored and state-approved churches. So understandably, the underground house movement in China is massive, and the interest in classical Christian education is exploding. Ravi has been there twice in the last year, but he's been there almost every year for the last 10. And he tells me that because you can't take your children to church anymore, people still want their children formed in the formed as Christians in this kind of comprehensive way. And so he tells me that there are 200 underground classical Christian schools. He said 50 of them we'd recognize them with dedicated faculty and dedicated spaces, but they're all underground. He says there are 2 to 3 colleges in China offering training in classical Christian education, kind of under the table. And he says he estimates 10,000 to 20,000 Chinese involved in classical Christian education in China, all underground. Remarkable work across the continent of Africa, China. Central and South America. 2 American organizations, Society for Classical Learning and the Association of Classical Christian Schools, are working with representatives across Central and South America to develop their own organizations comparable to what we have in the U.S. right now. In Ecuador, for instance, small country, 15 to 20 schools are currently transitioning to classical Christian schools, and there are 5 to 6 that are already fully classical in the little country of Ecuador. There's a printing press there that has already started to produce and print and distribute classical curricula, since shipping from the United States is, as you can imagine, somewhat costly. Our friend Chris Perrin, spoke at 2 conferences in Ecuador in the last year. Brazil. Major conference in Brazil this last year on classical Christian education. 92 schools represented, with 700 people attending and 800 people online in Brazil. At least 2 publishers are actively translating work from English into Spanish or into Portuguese and distributing it across Brazil. Another conference coming in January. Mexico, 5 to 10 classical Christian schools already underway, distribution network being set up for curricula, and a major conference planned there in 2026. Again, it's just a remarkable moment to be involved in this. But I'll just say, I mentioned this yesterday. We are but planting seeds and watering some seeds that others have planted, and we'll probably never see the full harvest of this. Right? This is a long, long work of the church. We've been at it for 2,000 years, so we ought not get impatient now. Other schools developing in Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Colombia, where another Alcuin fellow, David Diener, has spent a lot of time and is again supporting the work there. In Europe, a little less interesting in Europe. It's a little harder to do in Europe. But in England, for instance, like Chris and I have been there multiple times, and Ravi and I and another colleague we just hired in our program, we all did our degrees at Oxford, so we've got deep roots there. There are a lot of classical conversations communities. There are 30 across England. We had this dinner at the House of Lords in 2023 with probably a dozen MPs who are interested in seeing how they can develop private schools in the classical Christian model. And this last February, Jolie and I were both there at a major conference called the ARC Conference in London. We had 5,000 people there, and we hosted a major dinner there for probably, 200-300 people there at least, on classical education. Unfortunately, England just changed some of its tax laws, which made it much, much harder for private schools to exist. And some people think they did this to suppress the growth of Christian schools. And so the only fully fledged classical Christian school, King Alfred School in Birmingham, that had been there 3 years, had to close this year because of these new tax laws. But that said, there are 6 schools that are getting off the ground that hope to open their doors anyway in fall 2026, including a major one in Cardiff in Wales. Belgium, there's a classical Christian college that's just beginning. Spain, there are 2 Chesterton schools starting next year. And when we were in Europe, we met people from Georgia and Slovakia and the Netherlands who are also beginning small classical schools or working within their colleges to offer this kind of education. That, my friends, covers 6 of the 7 continents, and I'm being told that not a whole lot is happening in Antarctica yet. So maybe there's still good work to be done there. What we should see, though, is that this is just the long work of the church extended over space and time, and so we shouldn't be surprised when we see God's people doing this across the globe now. It just happens to be we're trying to recover what we lost 150 years ago, but what the church had always done. Now, let me close, and maybe if you're still skeptical about this being the work of the church, that part of the church's commission, it's entrusting by God, is to take this model of education to the world alongside its hospitals and alongside its naves. Let me take you to the heart of one of the most important churches in the world historically, the Vatican, in Rome, in a room called the Stanza della Segnatura, which just means the room where they would sign stuff. But it's sometimes known as the Raphael room. The Raphael room has 4 walls, like a lot of rooms do, and it's got a fresco on each wall. On one wall, you've got this fresco. Maybe this is what you would expect to see in a church in the Vatican. It is a great debate happening between the theologians of the church spread across space and time under the company of heaven about the center of the picture there, the consecrated host, about the incarnation and the Eucharist. And you'll see there the Eucharist, and you'll see on the right here Augustine. I love Augustine. He's the guy that's got books falling off his lap, and he's got his finger shoved in somewhere. And then you've got theologians on this side with books. And they're all in the company of heaven, and the prophets and the apostles kind of overseeing the whole thing as they debate about the Eucharist. And as a Dante guy, I just have to point out Dante in this right corner, the great Christian poet there among the theologians. Okay, so on one wall, you've got a great debate about what? The holy. Okay, the holy. Wall next to it, what do you have? Center of this, you've got not the consecrated host, but you've got Apollo. This is the great god of the muses, right? The god that inspires music. And so here we see the great poets of the tradition debating with one another. And I'll just point out the only figure in 2 frescoes here is my man Dante Alighieri. Some of you will appreciate that. And here's Dante talking to Virgil behind Homer's back. I don't know what they're talking about. Homer's blind. Maybe he doesn't know what's going on. But he's not deaf, so you probably hear him. But a lively exchange about the nature of poetry. And we've got Sappho on one side, and we've got the muses on another. And they're debating not the holy, but what? The beautiful. A great conversation extended across space and time on that wall about what it is to be beautiful. What's on the third wall? A painting we probably know, right? But how many of us know there are 4 walls in that room, not just one? And here's the great school of Athens, right? At the center of this, you see 2 figures, Plato and Aristotle, but actually the very center of the painting is not Plato and Aristotle, but the space between them. And what's taking up that space? Words, conversation, the great conversation. And here you see the great philosophers and the great teachers of the liberal arts all together in one space. And we have Pythagoras and Empedocles and Socrates, all focused on, there's astronomy and geometry, debating not the holy, not the beautiful, but the true, right? 3 walls. What's on the 4th wall? Oh, the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues. And here, if we had time to unpack it, I would show you how the 3 theological virtues are all helping the 4 cardinal virtues reach their telos. And you've got faith, you've got hope, and you've got love, and you've got justice, courage, temperance, and prudence. And they don't represent the holy, or the beautiful, or the true, but what? The good. So in this one room, at the center of one of the most important churches in the world historically, you've got this great conversation going on about the true, the good, the beautiful, and the holy, which is the very heart of the classical Christian tradition and at the very heart of the church's mission in the world. Now, I do like to imagine the kind of night at the museum scenario going on here, what after the lights go out, right? And it's probably good the virtues are there to keep everybody in check, and kind of control things as they debate with one another across wall to wall. But again, I just want to note, these are all together in one room. Integrated, holistic, representing the holistic formation for the sake of human flourishing that the church has always brought to the world as part of its deep calling to be the people of God. Integral to its 2,000-year history and integral to the work of the church, both historically and in the present moment. So friends, we are part of this great tradition, planting seeds, watering seeds, and we may never see the harvest, but it's deeply good work to be a part of, and I'm glad that we share in this work together. Thank you.